Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing our Eastern Front week, although actually we will spread a little bit further across the theatre in this show. And anyway, to carry on my introduction, through various ways, the war crimes trials and hundreds of biographies, the Naziness of many of the senior figures of the Third Reich has been examined again and again and again. But just how dedicated to the ideology was the average German soldier? Historian David Harrisville joins us to share his findings and look at this somewhat complicated subject. So, good morning, David. How are you today?
Good morning. Doing pretty well. Spring is in the air, finally, over here in Rhode Island.
Good.
So thanks
So
for having me.
how and why have you been looking at this subject? Because it's one of those ones that determining a conclusion, as we will find out, is complicated. You can go to the archives and find out the date a particular thing was said at the meeting, go, ha, that's the bit of information I needed to finish that chapter. But something about this, it's a quest with really a difficult sort of set of parameters. So how and why did it start?
So I started studying the Wehrmacht in graduate school quite a while ago. I was always interested in the German side of World War II, especially just I think the bad guys are more interesting to me for some reason, trying to figure out what makes these guys tick? Why were they fighting? Why were they doing this? They were obviously on the wrong side. And in graduate school, I wrote my dissertation about ordinary soldiers on the Eastern Front, taking a look at their letters. So I read over 2,000 letters by German soldiers. I picked out about 30 soldiers that I found in the archives in Berlin. And since then, I've read a lot more, read lots of secondary literature as well. And I wrote a book called The Virtuous Wehrmacht that came out in late 2021, for which viewers of this channel may know that.
Link in the description below, folks. If you haven't checked that out, go and check it out after this one.
Yeah, I talked about that. So my interest is, in these ordinary guys and kind of what made them tick. What were they thinking? Why were they doing this? And I've always found that, I don't know, somehow a little more fascinating than the generals or the strategic aspect of the war. Hard to say exactly why, but I find it an endlessly fascinating topic. And like you said, it's one you can go down this rabbit hole forever, and you aren't necessarily going to get, cut and dry answers.
Well, that's one of the great things about YouTube and podcasts is you don't have to necessarily reach a conclusion. You can just toss an idea around, discuss it for a bit and go, yeah, well, we're still in some ways none the wiser, but we've learned a little bit of background along the way. And folks, people are already asking about how we're going to do questions, like Gary is saying. So basically, because it can be a kind of a broader theme show today, we'll probably do the majority of the questions at the end after David has spoken. But if there's anything particularly pertaining to what David's talking about, we'll address them as we go along and I will jump in. But basically at this point now, I'll bring up David's PowerPoint, and it's in him to take it through this. And just a quick thing that you mentioned about the letters there, and it was David Stahl said on Monday, he thinks it was 6 billion letters sent by the German military in World War II, which is absolutely extraordinary.
I'd say it's actually even a little bit more. I've seen 10 billion thrown around as a number.
That blew my mind, because we're going down a rabbit hole we haven't even barely started, but I think of the efficiency of the Allies with the British, with the field service postcard system, and the Americans with the V-mail and that kind of thing. I always think of the Germans as being a little bit behind in terms of that kind of systems. But yes, 6 billion letters sent. It's extraordinary.
They managed to spend a lot of time writing somehow, despite the paper shortage. So today I have, this is just kind of an outline of what I want to talk about, to share my research and also that of other people. So I wanted to talk just a little background about this question of how Nazi was the German soldier. It has a whole history. I don't want to spend too much time about it, but I want to give people the context because the answer has kind of changed over time, if there is an answer. Which is why I want to spend some time talking about why it's so hard to give some kind of definitive answer. And those, billions of letters, that is one factor. How do you possibly read through all those in a lifetime? You really can't. Then I want to go through kind of the current state of the research. So I'll talk about my research, but also that of a lot of other folks over the past years, and kind of give a sense of where we're at with this question. Do we know anything more than we did, 10 or 20 years ago? Again, kind of like circling around this question, trying to give some kind of tentative answers, and then I'll end with some concluding remarks. And I don't want to spoil everything, but it's complicated. It's kind of the one of the main takeaways. So let's get into the background a little bit. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time, since I'm sure other guests of yours have talked about this as well. But for a very long time after the end of the war, the answer to the question of how Nazi the German soldier was seemed to be definitively answered, and that answer was not at all. Most Germans, not to mention the Americans, the British, had this impression that the German army was relatively clean, quote unquote, hadn't committed any crimes, stayed away from the Nazi regime, and was just generally a kind of a conventional army, relatively upstanding. And a lot of that had to do with Cold War politics, and the fact that German soldiers didn't want to admit some kind of guilt. Of course, there was a period of denazification after the war, and the Allies were trying to determine who's guilty, who's not guilty, who's a Nazi, etc. So I have a picture from the Nuremberg trials there. And as far as the Wehrmacht goes, it kind of got off the hook. It wasn't declared a criminal organization the way the SS was, for example. You had the high command trials where a few of the top generals are put on trial. Some of them are put in jail. A few of them are executed. But as far as the ordinary soldiers go, almost none of them were ever prosecuted. There were a couple of trials, but that's about it. So for a whole host of reasons, this was kind of the story that most people believed after the war. And then I want to mention Schills and Janowitz. So there are a couple of scholars, I think they're sociologists, who wrote a rather famous article in 1948 about the Wehrmacht and the motivations of the average soldier. And they basically concluded that Nazism really wasn't a major factor for the soldiers. What motivated them was fighting for their comrades. And the German army had set up this system where people from the same region, men from the same region in Germany, would be in the same division. And so you kind of have all your friends there, your buddies, and this is what held the army together, was this sense of comradeship and belonging to your unit, not Nazi ideology. So that was really the state of the field for a long time. And then in the 1990s, Omer Bartov, who happens to work at Brown University, where I also am, looked more deeply into the rank and file and essentially said that Schills and Janowitz got this completely wrong, that actually indoctrination and ideology were a very large part of why German soldiers were fighting, and put forward this sort of ideology thesis that has been extremely influential. At the same time as Bartov was looking, and it wasn't just Bartov, you had Stephen Fritz and a whole host of historians making this argument. And in the meantime, in the bigger picture, this myth of the clean Wehrmacht was starting to fall apart. Historians were finding that actually the army was heavily involved in crimes, including the Holocaust. And we know more and more about this today. The high command was, relatively Nazified, I would say. And David Stahel talked about some of the generals the other day. The army issues all kinds of orders telling soldiers to destroy the Jewish Bolshevik enemy and wage this kind of war of extermination on the Eastern Front, which is what I'm going to talk mostly about today. So we know now that this was a heavily indoctrinated institution that was basically doing what Hitler wanted it to do, and sort of exterminating, so-called subhuman races on the Eastern Front, and was heavily involved in the Holocaust. So that's kind of some big picture background. But now I want to talk about why it's so hard to address this question about the average soldier. So a lot of it comes down to the sources we have, and also the size of the army. I mean, for one thing, there are about 18 million men in the Wehrmacht in World War II, about 10 million on the Eastern Front. So you're already talking about like a small country of people that you're trying to learn about. As far as sources go, unfortunately, the army didn't like go around giving surveys to all of these guys or something like that. So we don't have a lot of kind of personnel records about their worldviews. For example, the army did censor letters that soldiers were writing. So we do have a handful of censor reports. And I looked for these in the archives in Freiburg. I've read a few of them, but unfortunately, almost all of them were destroyed. So I think we've got like 5 or something like that survive. They provide, snippets of quotations from soldiers and kind of general sense of, were soldiers supporting Hitler or not, that kind of thing. But they're generally not particularly useful. So a lot of historians, including myself, have turned to letters as a major source. And they are fairly promising. They're written during the war, so you get this kind of unfiltered, relatively unfiltered view of what soldiers are thinking, what soldiers are doing. But as you mentioned, they wrote a lot of these, right? So I've seen the figure of 10 billion letters that they wrote, and not all of them survived the war, of course. But historians, I did some like napkin math. I'm not a mathematician, but I'd say historians have looked at something like 20,000, maybe 30,000 letters. I looked at a couple thousand. Michaela Kipp, another scholar, looked at 7,000. So she really did a lot of reading. But that amounts to something like 0.002% of 10 billion. So trying to get some kind of like scientific representative sample is a bit of a fool's errand. So historians have had to just spend a lot of time reading these, and you can see the terrible handwriting. Actually, this guy has pretty good handwriting. This is a letter from.
If that's the good handwriting. I hate to see the bad.
That's actually really good handwriting. So you've got that problem with letters. There are just so many of them. Censorship is another issue. So, as I mentioned, censors were reading letters, so soldiers may not have always been particularly open and honest, especially when it came to talking about, do I support Hitler or not? Well, they're probably going to say yes, I imagine. So letters can be a great source, but also, an imperfect one. Diaries are another potential source. These can be great, but we also just don't have many of them, partly because of the paper shortage, partly because just not that many soldiers wrote diaries or were able to do so. So I've used them as kind of a supplemental source, but they're a little bit limited. But some of your viewers may have seen relatively new source is from prisoners of war in Allied camps. So a couple of historians, Harold Welzer and Sönke Neitzel and Felix Römer, discovered a kind of treasure trove from Allied sort of prisoner of war camps during the war. You've got like interrogation records, surveys that the Allies gave to thousands of prisoners, and maybe the most useful were recorded conversations of German soldiers who didn't know they were being recorded. The Allies put microphones in their rooms, and And so we have this pretty interesting source that kind of gets into the mindset of the soldiers. So that's been very helpful. Trial records. So you've got post-war records. Unfortunately, there weren't many trials, like I said, of ordinary soldiers. There are a couple of them. Waitman Bourne, a friend of mine, has looked into some of those. Potentially useful, but every post-war source has the problem that a lot of these guys kind of whitewash their stories. They had time to embellish it, or maybe they just forgot what happened. So you've got memoirs and interviews as well, but you can't always trust that these folks are not changing the story a little bit. So bottom line there, it's pretty difficult to dive into this subject. And what a lot of people, including myself, have done is just methodically read through thousands of letters to try to get a sense of what these guys were thinking, knowing that we're probably not going to get to the 10 billion mark anytime soon. So that's one problem, is the sources. Another big problem is just who's a Nazi. Like I mentioned, the Allies tried this denazification program after the war. It ended up not really working, partly because it was really difficult to figure out who is a Nazi. And, this is something that historians have been writing about for decades, delving into the nuances of Nazi ideology, looking at Nazi leaders, ordinary Germans, and it gets incredibly complicated. And, I'd be curious how you or other viewers define a Nazi. There's so many different things you could say. Is a Nazi someone who signs their letters with Heil Hitler?
Yeah.
Is a Nazi someone who was an actual member of the Nazi Party or a Nazi organization like the SA? Is it someone who believes everything that Hitler believed? So you had
a representative comment. That came in a bit earlier is a friend's grandfather fought with the SS. He joined to fight communism. He said, "I wanted to fight with the best against the worst. It was too late to get out when he realized the SS was the worst." But I'm going to pose the rhetorical question: is it necessarily wrong to join up to want to fight communism? And I kind of would say possibly not. But at what point does wanting to get rid of communism become being a Nazi? I mean, obviously they're inextricably linked. There's connections, but I'm already perplexed by the nuances here.
Yeah, so we're going to dive into exactly those kinds of nuances and what motivations do these guys have, and fighting communism is a pretty big one on the Eastern Front. So I'd like to proffer a very tentative sort of definition of my own. This is just based on my research and a lot of books that I've read of what a Nazi could be. So I'd say potentially someone who believed in a hierarchy of distinct races, with Germans somewhere at the top. Jews are very much at the bottom, locked in a struggle for existence. And perhaps someone who believed that keeping the race pure, following Hitler, and destroying racial enemies and taking their land, Lebensraum, right, were important things to do. And someone whose actions actually tended to support these goals. So someone else's definition might differ from this. There are so many different shades. So many different historians disagree. But that's generally what I would think of as a kind of core of the Nazi ideology. So if we're looking for a Nazi German soldier, they might believe a fair bit of this, perhaps. So other problems you run into, and I'll get to the soldiers in a second. But one is cherry picking. So you can write a book about German soldiers that is just filled with anti-Semitic and racist quotes. And people have done this. But you could also write a book with the exact opposite, taking examples of the most decent and honorable soldiers and putting those together and trying to make the exact opposite argument. There are just so many letters, so many sources, and so many soldiers that it's pretty difficult to get the sense of like a representative sample and an average. And another problem is internal contradictions. So you don't have to like read this page that I have here, but this is a really interesting conversation that was overheard by the allies of two German prisoners talking. And they're talking about the Nazis and sort of what they've done to Germany and how they brought war to Germany. And one of them says, the man's crazy. And then the other guy agrees. I have no idea where the Nazis are going to land us in the end. That swine with his brown shirt. So presumably talking about Hitler as a swine. So you might think, okay, well, these guys aren't Nazis. But then the conversation continues and you get this. There's quite a lot of good in it. I'll admit it's all right about the Jews. I don't think the racial problem has been at all badly handled. And then the other guy says, our racial policy is excellent. Also, the Jewish question and the entire legislation for preserving the purity of German blood, that law is really first class. So are these guys anti-Nazis or are they Nazis? It's kind of hard to tell. You could sort of make an argument either way. And this gets to the fact that, ordinary people aren't exactly internally consistent about everything they believe or everything they say. And that's the same for soldiers. So you'll find guys who really seem like Nazis, and then they do something that seems to be completely going the other direction. So those are kind of reasons why this is such a tough question. And now I want to get into, well, what sort of very tentative answers can we try to give based on all the scholarship that's come out since the 1990s? So there have been a lot of books, including my own, which I put up there, about German soldiers, folks who have read their letters or their diaries or their court records and tried to, delve into what made these guys tick. So what I'm going to present now are kind of general categories of sort of topics and things that I want to kind of tell you what historians generally agree on today, and then how that relates to this Nazi question. And I've also got a number of quotes from German soldiers. So one thing we are quite sure about is that soldiers admired Adolf Hitler. The vast majority of them, it seems. In my own work, I've seen, pretty much every soldier I've studied, with only a couple of exceptions, believes that Hitler is a great leader who is kind of revitalizing Germany, fix the economy, and he is also this great military strategist who's going to lead them to victory. Our Führer is a man whom no one in this world surpasses, is kind of a similar or a general sentiment. And there was a survey that we have of German prisoners of war, and 55% of them said that they greatly admired Hitler, and only 9% of them said they didn't like Hitler. And these are prisoners of war who are losing the war, who still admitted to this kind of love for the Führer. So that's kind of a point on the Nazi side, I would say. But at the same time, admiring Hitler, does that automatically make you a Nazi?
Well, Time magazine, 1938. I mean, Man of the Year. I mean,
right. And a lot of Germans liked Hitler, but that may not necessarily mean that a soldier believed everything that Hitler believed. So that's where some of this complication starts coming in. Another thing that we are fairly sure that we know about these guys is they loved Germany quite a bit. So I don't want to dwell too long on this subject. It's I think relatively obvious, but just like their fathers in World War I, they talk about fighting for Germany, how much they believe in Germany, how beautiful Germany is. And when they go into Eastern Europe, they're all homesick for the beautiful German Heimat, the homeland. And, they think Germany is so much better than Poland or these other places where they find themselves. And so a lot of them are kind of traditional nationalists. They want to fight for Germany, and that's often a pretty central motivation for them. Again, this could be Nazi, right? Like, you could be an extreme German nationalist and perhaps drift into the Nazi camp in that way. But you could also be a sort of traditional nationalist, and you're not too far away from World War I soldiers, for example.
When does patriotism become nationalism? I mean, again, these are questions that are hard.
Yeah.
The British guys who went and volunteered in 1939 loved their country. At what point does that become thinking you're better than other countries? I mean, certainly I would think that if you're a British soldier volunteering in 1939, you thought you were better than the Germans, based on the experience of 20 years earlier. God, these are so complicated. I'm loving this conversation because it's always when we get into this channel, it's that the definition of language when we talk about resistance and collaboration and patriotism and nationalism and it's already in the sidebar. It's breaking out about socialism and communism, and we all have different interpretations of exactly the same words, and we use them in the way that we like. Woke is another example. I get accused of being woke, and some people use it as insult, and some people use it as a compliment. And to each of those people, it's both of those things.
Exactly. And that's going to come up many times as we talk about this. Another thing that historians generally agree on is that German soldiers embrace the soldier's life. So Germany has a reputation of this being a kind of militarized country. The army was highly valued. Soldiers were highly respected, not just from World War II, but for generations before then. And you see soldiers really kind of even like, I've studied soldiers like this guy, actually, Harold, whose quote I have up here, was in his, I think, late 30s. He was a little too old to be a soldier, but he was part of Operation Barbarossa. He kept getting hurt and needing medical attention because he couldn't keep up with the younger guys. So he wasn't really cut out to be a soldier. But even a guy like him believed that it was good to be a soldier, that you should be in danger, that to be a good masculine German man, you need to be in the army for at least part of your life. And generally soldiers, they talked about all the medals that they've earned and all the promotions they've gotten and how proficient they are with their weapons. POWs have all, talk about this all the time in their recorded conversations. So they see themselves as professionals, as members of this great institution that is, superior perhaps to other armies. And one of the most interesting things I've learned recently is I read a book about desertion in the German army that just came out last year by a guy named Stefan Kurt Schreiber. Unfortunately, the book is in German, but he talks about deserters in the Wehrmacht. And anytime a guy deserted, his commanding officer would have to write a report about him. But one of the things the author discovered is these commanders were consistently saying that the guys who deserted had been great soldiers. Like they were good comrades, they followed orders, they had done a good job, they integrated well into their units. So even the guys who ended up leaving the army and running away, apparently, at least for much of their time, were still getting along well as soldiers. And Felix Römer has studied working class soldiers and Catholic soldiers, folks who might be expected to maybe not get along so well in the Wehrmacht, but he says, in fact, no, they're kind of like everybody else. They They get along well with their comrades. They embrace their promotions and their medals, and they want to be good soldiers too. So this is a theme that historians generally agree on. Crimes, we could spend an enormous amount of time talking about this, but scholars universally agree that Wehrmacht soldiers committed atrocities on a vast scale. About 15 million Soviet civilians are killed during the war, many of them, really most of them, by the Wehrmacht, not to mention millions of prisoners of war. The army was wiping out entire villages left and right, and soldiers wrote about this in their letters. About 2/3 of the soldiers that I studied mention German war crimes, and usually many times. They'll talk about stealing. They talk about scorched earth policies. And here's just one example with this quotation about a guy whose unit just essentially wiped out 3 villages in response to some partisan activity. So this is a pretty typical action. And so, getting back to the question of were they Nazis? Well, if they are committing these kinds of crimes, that certainly seems to, put them more on the Nazi side. Although I want to talk a little more in detail about motivations behind crimes in a little bit. Next point. So this is where things get quite complicated. German superiority. So as far as we can tell, most soldiers believed that Germany was a great country, generally better than others. The Wehrmacht is better than other militaries. And Germans are these cultured and well-educated and kind of economically advanced people, especially compared to Russians or Ukrainians or other folks they meet in the East. They talk a lot about the dirtiness and the backwardness of the Soviet Union. The people they meet are kind of dumb, not well-educated, primitive. They live in these little huts. They use newspapers as wallpaper, that kind of thing. So there's a general sense of we have the right to rule the East. We are a advanced people, and this is where you see a lot of overlap with Nazism. On the one hand, and this can easily bleed into racist ideas that Germans are biologically superior and other people are subhuman. But where it's complicated is a lot of soldiers tend to see themselves as sort of like culturally superior or economically superior, rather than necessarily racially superior. And it's very difficult to try to figure out where that line is and exactly where the sense of superiority comes from. So this is something I've definitely wrestled with myself, because a lot of these things are sort of Nazi adjacent and can certainly head in the direction of Nazism. But you can also imagine someone who just thinks, oh, wow, these people are poor. It's better in Germany. Does not make you a Nazi. Kind of hard to tell. Indoctrination. So we definitely know that indoctrination was a large part of service in the Wehrmacht. There's a guy, Bryce Sate, who's written a book recently all about this. Soldiers were lectured to, they were given all kinds of pamphlets and things to read, telling them about the Nazi worldview. Generals were issuing orders about destroying the Jewish Bolsheviks, things like that. Soldiers had to take the oath to Adolf Hitler. And in fact, it was actually the army's idea to implement the oath. Hitler didn't tell them they had to do it. They sort of volunteered, like, we want to implement this. So indoctrination is a big part of, the life of the Wehrmacht. But on the other hand, did soldiers actually believe this stuff? We can sort of prove that the Wehrmacht printed, 20 million pamphlets about racial purity or something like that. But did soldiers read them? Did soldiers care? Did soldiers actually absorb this material? that is where it gets tricky. No definitive answers yet there. But on the other hand, so did soldiers sort of self-identify as Nazis? And this is where a lot of recent scholarship diverges from Omer Bartov's thesis about Nazism being really kind of the touchstone of motivation for soldiers. So Michaela Kipp, for example, writes that soldiers frequently were not convinced Nazis. That's after studying about 7,000 letters. Neitzel and Meltzer, looking at soldiers' conversations as POWs, say that military values, the military and wartime frame of reference, were sort of more important to them than ideology. And this kind of gets to this phenomenon that a lot of soldiers, ones I've studied, ones other people have studied, don't seem to really care very much about ideology. They seem to see themselves as like pragmatic people. They're not really interested in politics. They, they might like Hitler, but they don't necessarily like memorize his speeches or, believe like every point of the Nazi creed. So they don't use Nazi terminology very often. So there are terms like Volksgemeinschaft, which is this like racial national community that's very central for the Nazis. You don't really see soldiers ever use that word in their writings. They don't refer to themselves as heroes like the Nazis do. They don't really refer to the people they're fighting as subhumans or Bolsheviks. They usually call them Russians on the Eastern Front. So there are many different kind of data points that give us a sense that most of them didn't really see themselves explicitly as like racial warriors fighting a war of extermination to destroy subhuman races. They may have absorbed Nazi ideology in various ways, but they didn't necessarily think of themselves as Nazis. So that's where things, again, get even more complicated.
Just to throw a counterpoint in there, when I was going to England matches, football, back in my youth, there were really nasty people going to those matches who were there for the violence. They were there to inflict violence on other people. But if you'd asked any of them, they would never have described themselves as soccer hooligans. They would never have said that was why they were there. So someone not saying they're something doesn't mean they aren't that person.
True. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
We're all getting closer and closer to this idea that it's going to be complicated, this whole thing. But I'm trying to relate this to myself, because I can't really put myself in the position of a German soldier in the Eastern Front in 1941. But I can kind of think about my life and people I knew who would deny they were things that were clear to the rest of us, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly. Do you need to think of yourself as a Nazi to be a Nazi? Probably not. Probably not.
Yeah.
So another point I want to make is that Nazism wasn't the only thing that influenced soldiers. And this is something a lot of folks have written about. I've written about as well. You've got a whole host of things they believe in, and I've listed a few of them up here, kind of traditional values, of course, believing in the German nation, very basic moral concepts that are, hundreds of years old, the 10 Commandments, for example. A lot of these guys, grew up going to Sunday school, of course, even though, they also grow up in a Nazi society. Middle-class values, the value of hard work, family, culture, cleanliness, education, etc. Military values, comradeship, duty, strength. I've written a lot about how soldiers embrace various aspects of these values. And some of them seem to contradict Nazism a little bit. If you believe that murder is bad. Well, Hitler might disagree with you in many cases. Believing in concepts like honor, that doesn't seem particularly Nazi. So in general, historians have kind of broadened out the sense of like what soldiers believed in. Like, it's not just Nazism, it's Nazism and a whole bunch of other things. So that spectrum has kind of gotten bigger. And, you can see plenty of soldiers who kind of stay in this stage. Like, what they believe is very similar to what their dad believed in World War I, without necessarily taking the next step into Nazi beliefs. However, there is a lot of overlap here, a lot of ideas that can easily sort of translate into Nazism or take people in that direction. And I just have a couple of examples here. If you believe in hard work, education, order, etc., you might believe that Germans are inherently racially superior to other people. They're, better educated, more cultured. So that can play into this racial kind of categorization. You might also begin to believe that non-Germans are not worthy of life because they are, beneath the German level. In a lot of ways. If you believe in these military values, well, you're not necessarily that far away from the Nazis, who believed in showing no mercy, being completely hard, having no real emotions, doing what you're told without questioning, believing that only you and your comrades are worthy as human beings, and the people you're fighting are absolute subhumans. So here again, it's you could kind of exist on some kind of spectrum, right? Maybe you believe in some traditional values, but you're also kind of making your way toward acceptance of Nazism, and the complications just keep piling on at this point. Views of other people. So this is, again, where we get into some interesting territory with the soldiers. And some of it was very surprising to me. So I want to talk about how they see the Red Army, civilians, and then Jews in particular. And I'll keep each of these short. But as far as the Red Army goes, so you have some soldiers who see Soviets as animals, as this horde, like this quote here shows. There's a lot of hatred of the commissars, on the Bolsheviks, and a lot of soldiers who remark on the racial composition of the Red Army and how some Soviet soldiers look more Asian because they're from the Far East, and this is kind of disturbing to German soldiers. And there are all kinds of accusations of atrocities, and this idea that the Soviets fight like Eastern barbarians or something like that. At the same time, there's quite a bit of respect for the red soldier. So soldiers recognize very early on that the Soviets are much tougher opponents than anyone they've run into before. They talk about how skilled the Soviet soldiers are. They never give up. They fight to the last man. They kind of sacrifice themselves, but they're pretty brave. They are not to be taken lightly. So there's this kind of weird dichotomy between racism on the one hand, but this also kind of grudging respect on the other. And also soldiers who express a kind of sympathy for ordinary Russian soldiers because they think they've been sort of tricked into fighting by their Bolshevik masters and their lives are being thrown away and that sort of thing. So pretty complicated views of the Red Army, in fact. Not exactly what Nazi propaganda would say. Civilians might be the most complicated category. This is where you see all kinds of ideas of German superiority, some of it racial superiority, a lot of talk of the dirtiness and poverty and stupidity or laziness of the population, not to mention all kinds of crimes that the soldiers are committing against these people on a daily basis. At the same time, I was sort of shocked at how many soldiers express sympathy for the population. And I've seen many cases of soldiers sharing food with people or sharing cigarettes, seeming to have kind of friendly relations with some civilians, not all civilians, but some of them, like when they lived in the same houses. Here we have a quote from a soldier named Wilhelm Moldenhauser, who talks about getting along with this family that he's staying in. And later he gives candy to their kids and tells them that everything's going to be okay. The Soviets are gone and the Germans are here, and we're going to be nice to you. And this guy also is like a colonialist, and he's a member of the SA. So when it comes to civilians, soldiers aren't necessarily, perfectly following Nazi ideology and seeing all these people as subhumans that they need to exterminate. There's a very complicated relationship that blends, sympathy and racism and cultural superiority, and then some of these kind of friendly interactions that are very, very strange and unexpected. As far as Jews go, so Jews were sort of in their own category. Most soldiers seem to have been anti-Semites of one flavor or another. They talk about Jews being dirty and stealing people's money, and there are all kinds of stereotypes that are thrown their way by German soldiers. I've seen soldiers who talk about the execution of Jews, whether by the SS or by the Wehrmacht, and speak approvingly about that. I really have found almost no positive descriptions of Jews. There are a couple of soldiers who talked about how Jewish women are used as forced labor for their unit, and they're doing a pretty good job, and they keep the soldiers' rooms clean and things like that. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, the question becomes sort of what version of anti-Semitism is this? Are these, so there's sort of like the Nazi racial eliminationist anti-Semitism, that Jews are subhuman and must be exterminated. And then there's also a kind of more traditional anti-Semitism that was around in Germany for centuries. Stereotypes about Jews being greedy, unsavory people, that sort of thing. And in the Wehrmacht, it's hard to tease out exactly if a particular soldier is, a genocidal anti-Semite, racist, or someone who just kind of grew up being told that Jews are, unsavory people that we need to sort of avoid contact with. And unfortunately, they don't, Wehrmacht soldiers in general don't have a lot of contact with Jews, so it's very hard to get that answer of, what kind of anti-Semites they were. But certainly anti-Semitism is absolutely rife in the Wehrmacht. Motivations for fighting. So I apologize for this wall of text here. But Omer Bartov posited that Nazi ideology was a primary reason why soldiers were fighting on the Eastern Front. And I myself and other historians have kind of complicated that view and found that there are just so many different motivations that different soldiers cite for why they're fighting. And in this quote, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this is a conversation between 4 soldiers talking about what are we doing here fighting in the Soviet Union. Apparently this guy, he's a Lieutenant Heinz Rahe, didn't get the official memo. So he doesn't really know, what the Nazi regime said about this invasion. So he and his friends are talking. One guy says that the reason for the war is we need to get rid of the Jewish commissars. So sounds pretty Nazi to me, I would say. Another soldier says maybe it would be better if we had built an east wall in order to defend ourselves from this. So maybe we shouldn't have really attacked, I guess. But we needed the fertile Ukraine as a supply base for further warfare. And Heinz Rahe thinks, yeah, that kind of makes sense. We need to eat. So you have this kind of economic idea going on. Then Heinz himself talks about freeing Ukraine and bringing Christianity back to Ukraine as his motivation. Kind of interesting. Not exactly, what Hitler would have, I think, imagined as the reason his soldiers should be fighting. And then finally, the last guy mentioned, Pastor Eichhoff. I don't know if he's a chaplain. Perhaps he was. He believes that, I guess, the reason for the war is God wants Germany to destroy Soviet rule. But Heinz himself disagrees with this interpretation. So what I'm trying to get at here with this quotation is that you find many, many different motivations among German soldiers. Some of them believe this official line that we're going in to destroy Jewish Bolshevism or colonize the East and seize Lebensraum for the German people. But other soldiers believe all kinds of different things about why they're there, what they're fighting for. Maybe it's for the German nation. You have fantasies of liberating people from communism, bringing religion to the East. Rather strange idea that's quite far from any kind of Nazi propaganda. So here, again, we see a very complicated picture. You really have to kind of take each guy by himself and see what he says. I don't see a faster way of doing that. Motivations for crimes. So I wrote a chapter in my book about soldiers explaining their own atrocities. Michaela Kipp has written a really interesting article about soldiers explaining their participation in the Holocaust. And you would kind of expect in a Nazified army for soldiers to use ideology as one of their major explanations, right? So we burned down this village because these people are subhuman scum, and our mission is to, eliminate them so we can get Lebensraum or something like that. I don't really run into that too much when they talk about German crimes. Very often they talk about the Soviets committed crimes first, so we responded. Like Soviet soldiers killed some of our prisoners, and that's why we're not taking prisoners. When it comes to the Holocaust, a lot of soldiers will talk about how Jews are partisans, and they, maybe they committed some kind of act of sabotage, and therefore that's why we executed them.
Again, to jump in, that's interesting because I don't want to talk about football again, trivializing a very serious subject. But again, that the people who I knew who went to football for violence would have said the same thing, that it was the other fans always started it. We weren't there for that.
Yes.
We just started hitting them because they were hitting us, or they were provoking us to hit them. Again, I'm not going to draw too big a intellectual connection between these two distinctly separate subjects, but it's interesting that I'm sure that's what they would have said, that we were just reacting. It was because it happened to us.
Yeah, and that's why it's very difficult to tell what they actually believe, right? Are they actually doing this because of ideological conviction or race, racist views, or do they actually believe that they're just kind of balancing the scales or something like that? It's trying to delve into their psyche using their own words can be extremely difficult. One point that Neitzel and Welzer had made, and you also see Christopher Browning make in his book Ordinary Men, is it doesn't seem like racism and anti-Semitism were a necessary precondition for participating in atrocities. You see plenty of soldiers who don't seem particularly racist, who are still participating in the destruction of villages or the murder of civilians, the murder of Jews. So motivations are a very tricky thing, but they could involve ideology, but they didn't necessarily have to. So now we're getting to the conclusion here, and this gets a little bit messy, but I guess probably the biggest takeaway is just how complicated this question really is. The more you delve into it, you find all kinds of contradictions. You find soldiers who really seem like they're hardcore Nazis, but then they do something that doesn't really make sense. You've got your billions of letters that you're trying to go through somehow to get an answer. And, in our lifetimes, I don't really expect us to have an answer. But historians have to kind of accept sometimes that you may not find the Holy Grail, but you can at least sort of try to get as close as you can down that road. As far as other points I want to make based on my research and that of a lot of other people, I would say generally the soldiers were not as Nazi as say Omer Bartov believed. They didn't necessarily all believe ideology hook, line, and sinker. Most of them weren't really hardcore Nazis going by the definition that I had stated before, where they really believe in this like biological superiority and the need to exterminate other peoples. However, they still participated. They went along with this war of extermination on the Eastern Front. They did their duty as soldiers for a whole host of reasons. Maybe it wasn't necessarily for ideological reasons, but they still kind of got there at the end of the day. A lot of them still believed in many traditional values, like I talked about before, even religious values, but that didn't make them anti-Nazis. On the one hand, they could have known better, I would say. Like they had enough influence from other kinds of value systems that they could have rejected the war or their participation. But in a lot of cases, I think, and I argue in my book, that soldiers used a lot of traditional values to kind of end up in the same place as soldiers who had more Nazi convictions. So, for example, if you thought you were fighting for your fatherland and you thought it was important to be a good man, that you needed to be in the army, and you generally didn't like Eastern Europeans, even if you weren't a hardcore racist, that was kind of enough, it seems. Like people like that still went along with this whole enterprise and often ended up committing crimes anyway, even if they weren't necessarily agreeing with everything Hitler everything Hitler believed. At the same time, I would say that Nazism absolutely infects the army and its men in all kinds of different ways, and I haven't found a single soldier who was immune to it in any kind of sense. Most of the soldiers I've studied believe in some of the same things that the Nazis did. Maybe it's not everything, but I would kind of say that the average soldier may not have been a Nazi, but he was sort of Nazi enough. He had enough views that were going in the same direction. Maybe believed part of the Nazi platform, and it was enough to get there.
But people don't go out and march and say, I'm broadly in agreement with some of the principles, but I reject some of them. I'm just you have to align yourself to for or against, and which is such a modern thing. So much of what you're saying, I'm just seeing all these modern echoes of you have to align yourself to a particular camp, hoist your flag up the flagpole, and often I'm somewhere between two flagpoles myself, but it's hard to put yourself in that position.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to that book about desertion in the German army, very few soldiers ever deserted the Wehrmacht, and when they did, it usually wasn't because they were against the Nazis or they were against the war. It was actually usually because a soldier had stolen his comrade's boots and was afraid of getting prosecuted or something like that. So even the guys who left were usually not resistors. So I guess one point we could take away is that the vast majority went along, right, and they were good soldiers and they essentially did what they were told. And then final point, so I was talking to Jeff Rutherford, a colleague of mine who studies the Eastern Front, about this question of who's a Nazi, what makes you a Nazi. And he made this interesting point that I would like to end on, which is, is being a Nazi about something you believe, or is it about something you do? And if it's about something you do, well, I think we can say that soldiers generally did what Hitler asked of them on the Eastern Front. They not only served and fought the Red Army, but they also participated in the murder and the exploitation of millions of people who were deemed to be subhumans. They generally did what they were told, and their actions furthered the goals of the Nazi regime, whether or not they necessarily believed in all of those goals. So I guess I'll end it on that note. I am very interested to see the questions we get. And
well, there's plenty of them. That's the first thing. We'll try and get whip through these reasonably quickly. Some of them are shorter ones, some of them are longer, but and they're in no particular order just as I've saved them. But talking about those 20,000 or so letters that were looked at, are there still many letters unread and looked at? Because clearly most of the 10 billion don't exist, but are there plenty that no one's read yet?
Oh yes, yeah, for sure. The archive that I was in Berlin, it's part of the Museum for Communication. They have, I think, something like 100,000 letters. It's not all from World War II, but mostly from World War II. And I was one of the first people to look at any of them. So yeah, there are, I'd say, millions probably unread. And of course, the sad thing is a lot of people, keep them in a box in their attic or something like that, and then eventually they're just lost unless they get into an archive somehow. But yeah, I'd say we're only really scratching the surface.
And a lot of it will just be mundane, as David was saying. A lot of letters anyone writes, the same would be across all the armies, is just, how are you? Yes, I received the cake you sent. How is
Yes.
so and so it's going on at school? All that kind of stuff, and you've got to read all through that to find the occasional moment where they get a bit deeper about the reasons, because soldiers, in my experience, don't tend to really go in too much to why and the whys and wheres when they're in the middle of a war.
They absolutely don't. It's needle in a haystack situation.
Yeah. Well, we'll carry on. So this point by Sean goes about what you were just saying a minute ago about the people going along with it but not necessarily speaking out. And Sean's saying most Germans would have expected their letters to be censored. So how willing would any soldier be to put any non-Nazi sentiment in writing, and how does that affect your research?
Yeah, I agree. I think it does affect research. One thing that has actually surprised me is that I have seen some soldiers who do criticize Hitler or criticize some aspects of the war. Harold, one of the guys I talked about earlier, he actually he really doesn't want to be there, and he talks about all the crimes that they're committing. And I think at one point he talks about how the Germans are like subhumans. So I would say censorship is a problem, and letters are probably less critical of the regime and the war than they otherwise would be. At the same time, there weren't many censors. They couldn't read many of the letters, these 10 billion or so, 6 billion. And a lot of soldiers seem to have just not really cared, actually, and still written things that went against the ideology. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I would say, yeah, that's absolutely a factor that influences letters as a source. And I think that's one reason why you need to triangulate and use prisoner of war records, use diaries, use everything you can to try to piece this together from different angles.
Okay, so we've got two about kind of age groups. So two similar subjects. So Trevor Sheehan, Mr. Tunisia, Africa in Stalingrad is saying, was there a generational difference in soldier attitudes? So kind of hold that thought. And then Gary is saying, you have to understand the total Nazi indoctrination of German social society in general from 1933. So anyone who's growing up as a child, then everything around them, schooling, Boy Scouts, Hitler Youth, is all just hammering this ideology in them. So in your understanding and research, is there a generational age difference in people's attitudes?
Yeah, I would say so. Yes. In my own research, it was kind of hard to see because I only looked at about 30 soldiers, which I consider kind of too small a sample to really talk about generations. But other scholars I've read would generally agree that the younger the soldier was, the more indoctrinated he was.
Yeah.
Because at a certain point, everyone has to be part of the Hitler Youth. There are all these other Nazi organizations that folks need to join. They're growing up in their formative years under the Third Reich. So you generally see the older guys are a little more independent minded. Same with the generals too. Like a lot of the guys who fought in World War I look a bit, quite a bit different than the more fanatical, hardcore Nazis of the younger officer generation. So I
thanks. For all of these questions could go down massive great rabbit holes. This is another fairly short one, I think, though. Is you're talking about the Trent Park and the POWs and the listening over to conversations of German officers. So when Germans were captured, was there a list of questions Allies asked to gauge their Naziness on a scale?
I don't know for sure. I mean, I recommend the book. It's called Soldaten,
right?
Which, I may have it here. I showed a picture of it earlier. It's by Harold Welzer and Sönke Neitzel.
I'm thinking of those modern kind of surveys where you get, do you agree with this statement? Very much so, mostly, not at all. Those kind of modern ways you get questionnaires. So how much do you think you're a Nazi? How much do you agree with the statement, I am a Nazi?
Right.
Yes or no? It's again,
and they did them for Hitler, right? They had a question about, how much do you like Hitler? And most of them said quite a bit. But I don't know the exact other questions they were asked, but I do think the Allies were, they were trying to sort people out. At this point.
So sorting people out via inherently flawed system. But a couple of quicker ones now. So, it's a comment more than a question there. Enemy from the East has long traditions in European self-image. Persians, Huns, Mongols, Ottomans, Russia, and eventually communism fits in that same framework. And you kind of touched on that European history goes back a hell of a long way, and some of these rivalries, stroke hatred, stroke whatever, go back millennia. So
Yeah.
but Hitler is playing on a lot of this old traditional stuff. We've talked about that with Katia Hoyer and Frank McDonough about it's the Nazi Party is a new concept, but it's playing on lots of older ideologies and mythology, and it's complicated again.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with all of that. There's a good book about the German myth of the East, I think is the title of it, about this sort of centuries old idea that there's this, these dangerous hordes that live beyond our borders, and they're having too many kids, and they're very aggressive, and they're going to come and destroy Germany. And so that's a very old concept.
And we've talked about it with like drill instructors and army veterans, that instilling hatred in other people is one of the easiest ways of bonding people, whether in any walk of life. Even going back to football again, we're better than that team over there because they're terrible, they're awful people. And so creating a sense of brotherhood, sense of belief, that they take longer to instill, but just uniting people through hatred is unfortunately a very, very easy thing to do.
Yeah. Yep, for sure.
So another question from Trevor there is, I feel it's a big rabbit hole. What part did religion have? After all, both the Germans and Russians were both notionally Christian.
So I wrote a chapter about this in my book, and I've written an article. So I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but I would say that actually religion wasn't a small factor for the Wehrmacht. Most of these soldiers grew up Christian, or at least sort of nominally Christian. 95% of Germans identified as being Christian in the 1930s. And when they go into the Soviet Union, well, they're fighting this atheist, avowedly atheist power. And one thing the Germans did was reopen churches that the Soviets had shut down. And so you see soldiers and also chaplains developing an idea that we are Christian crusaders who are coming and we're bringing religion back, just like that guy, Heinz Reich, whose quote I showed earlier. I think it's a minority idea. Like, most soldiers don't particularly care too much about religion. They don't write about it that much. But for some of them, it was a major motivation for fighting the atheist Bolsheviks on the Eastern Front. Absolutely. And that created some complications for the Nazis because Hitler was worried that German soldiers were going to Soviet church services and fraternizing with civilians. And so he issued an order that they couldn't worship together anymore.
Okay.
So, yeah.
A question from Gregory, but I'm going to expand on it. Have you found any difference in attitudes between soldiers from Germany and Austria, and of course the other countries that fought alongside the Axis? I mean, we mustn't forget the fact there were Romanians and Italians and everybody else there fighting on the Eastern Front. So, I mean, obviously your work is on the German soldier, but the other differences across the nations from your experience?
So I can't really speak to the Austrian question, unfortunately. I do know. Plenty of Austrians were drafted into the Wehrmacht, but I don't think any of the soldiers that I studied were actually from Austria. I would say, generally speaking, across the German alliance, Nazi ideology and race are much bigger for the Germans than they are for other countries. But on the Eastern Front, you have this idea of the anti-communist, this like international anti-communist crusade that is quite big in a number of countries, like Italy, Spain, Romania, for example. I know the Romanians, for them, religion was a bigger part of the war. They really leaned into this Christian crusade against communism kind of idea. So a good question. I'm afraid I don't, quite know enough about the Austrian experience to give a good answer.
Thank you for that. And JD from History Underground is just saying, I would really like for David to return and talk about religion in the Third Reich. And to add my 2 pence to that, JD, there's a book that came out fairly recently about the idea that the Nazi Party were entirely Christian based, and there are other authors who've written things say they're entirely atheistic based. So I'm loath to I'd love to do a set of shows about that, but I'm loath to maybe do it because I'm going to divide and split some of my audience who have different ideas on that, because it's a perennial discussion.
Yeah, it really is.
Just how much of a Christian was Hitler, and he said Christian things, and he said and you know, it's a complicated one. But yes, in principle, I would love to talk about religion in the Third Reich, but it's opening a massive, huge, monumental can of worms.
Yeah, I completely agree.
But a couple more questions for you. So we'll go another potentially long one. Trevor is asked again, how different were the German soldiers fighting in the last days of the war compared to the early days of the war? And I'll add the kind of is there a moment where you sense a change? I mean, I'm assuming on the way back from Moscow might have been a bit of a change, but seriously though, is there a change?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, in the early days, they're all very optimistic. They all think they're going to win and they're going to be home before Christmas. And you see this, like, many different motivations for why they're fighting. I would say it's hard to put an exact date on it.
Yeah.
But by like 1943, their letters are very different. They're like shorter. There aren't as many of them, and they're much more focused on survival than anything else. They don't spend a lot of time talking about, like, I don't know, grand plans for conquering the East or like grand strategy and ideas. It's much more like, we got surrounded today and I was the only guy who survived, and I'm kind of just trying to get home. The focus is on stopping the Russians from getting to Germany. I'd say, like, that's the main motivation in the later years of the war, rather than like, oh, we're gonna destroy the Bolsheviks or something. It's much more, it's about survival. Forget what was I gonna say? Victimhood. I'd say there's a lot of victimhood. Soldiers talking about just how all the suffering they're going through, you know, the mud and the diseases and the lice and
that, just to interrupt, that brings you to people like the work of people like Jonathan Fennell, who've looked at the letters home of British and American and Canadian soldiers, because they go through peaks and troughs as well. And there's a massive morale problem in the winter of 44, 45 when, you know, trench foot abounds in ETO, and the victory still seems quite a long way away, and people are grumbling about food again, and grumbling about their boots, and grumbling about their kit, and you see even not so much they're turning on their countries, but they're certainly not professing the same patriotic things they're saying before D-Day, when they say, I can't wait to get in there and start, you know, bringing freedom back to Europe. So, you know, that I was going to ask you earlier on, you know, whether people have done comparative studies about the beliefs within the Allied soldiers, because I've always maintained the reason the people enlist and the reason the people fight are not necessarily the same. And broadly speaking, there's this idea that you are fighting for the guy alongside you more than at the moment of that moment of running across the hill towards the enemy positions. You're not necessarily thinking about God, country, and flag. You're thinking about not letting Bill down to your left and Jim down to your right. Yeah,
I would absolutely agree. But yeah, there's a very noticeable change in the letters for sure.
Yeah, so we've got a couple more to go then. So this is an easy one. Well, I hope it's an easy one. Susan is using, who's one of our Patreon brigadiers. Is there another book coming along, David?
That's a good question. I actually don't know at the moment. I've thought about, you know, various ideas, but I haven't landed on any particular thing. I've got a couple of chapters coming out in other people's books in the near future. One is about how the German army issues all kinds of orders telling its soldiers to be decent and honorable, but also be merciless and shoot anyone who looks at you wrong. And it's about the idea of trying to present the army as a civilized institution, even though it's anything but. So yeah, I will think about it, you know, the topic of the next book, and we'll see, I guess. A lot of it depends on if I can get back to Germany and do some research.
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious of the fact that we've got a bit not much more time to go. Go on, get your words out, Woody. One from Gregory there is how much did the memory of the 1918 armistice play in terms of motivation for the German soldier? I mean, that's another big topic. We've discussed it before, but do you have a particular opinion?
I haven't seen too much of it in the soldiers that I studied, but in other people's books, it comes up. They talk about how much they hate the Versailles Treaty, how unfair everyone was to Germany after World War I. There is a bit of a sense of like unfinished business, like we kind of messed up in World War I. We lost that. This time we're going to do it right. We're going to win. And so soldiers, it's definitely in the back of their minds. And you do see soldiers hoping that, the home front isn't gonna collapse behind us, that sort of thing. I'd say it's there. The memory of 1918 and World War I is there, but it's not necessarily like at the front of soldiers' minds.
Yeah. And we've got another final question, although it's more of a comment really. And again, we thank you for the fact that this is someone who's given us a nice $10 super thanks, and not the shamelessly my cap in hand, but you can do a super thanks via to the channel if you're enjoying what we're doing. But it's about the foreigners again within the German army. Italians, Remains, Norwegians view the Soviet Union. I'm going to kind of add the idea that motivating an Italian to go into the Eastern Front via, you're not going to get anything out of it personally. You're not going to get living space for your nation, theoretically, or Romania. So that presents an even maybe a bigger challenge for the leaders of those units to kind of say, this is why we're going to go off and do what we're doing today. At least from the Nazis' point of view, there's a carrot in front of the donkey in terms of expansion of Germany. But what's your view on the motive? I mean, it's another big subject, but the motivation of foreigners. I know we touched on it earlier.
Yeah, I would say anti-communism might be the biggest one.
Yeah.
A lot of people, not just in Germany, across Europe, thought that the revolution in 1917 was the worst thing that had ever happened, and the communists were plotting to take over Europe and instigating revolutions. Like in Italy, I mean, a big reason Mussolini comes to power is because he's able to use the fear of communism to get support, because the workers are always going on strike, and Hitler kind of did the same thing. So I think the anti-communist crusade is probably the biggest motivation. I think for the Romanians, it's a little more religious as well, but perhaps they were also trying to get land. Grant Harward has written a book about Romania's
a couple of times. Yep, good old Grant. Yep.
Yeah. So
I mean, it's interesting, David, that we've come back to some of the things we talked about over an hour ago. That anti-communism is there. At what point does being anti-communist turn you into a Nazi? And we said at the beginning of this, we're going to leave this discussion with as many questions as we have answers. But I'm grateful to you for at least having a stab at it and trying to come up with some kind of rules. And I think your definition of the Nazi is something that will stick with me. As although some people will say no, it's not strong enough or it's too vague, but you've got to attempt to find some kind of parameter. And so I applaud you for that. But
thanks.
Yeah, what a brilliant conversation. Well, folks, thank you for your questions. Thank you for the ones we have answered and the ones we haven't answered. But we can't get to everyone in one show. But David, it's been a delight talking to you. Although I feel myself staying awake tonight, pondering some of these thoughts. But that's good. That's healthy to keep discussing these things. So thank you very much, folks. We're back again tomorrow, normal time, 7 p.m. UK time. Bastian is joining us to talk about the Battle of Königsberg and East Prussia in 1945. So looking forward to that. And then Prit Buttar is back. Who doesn't love a Prit Buttar show on Friday? So that's that coming up. So thanks, everybody. Don't forget to click, like, and subscribe. Check the link in the description below to David's previous appearance. And there's also the link to David's book in the description. Go out and get that. It's been fantastic. So thanks, everybody. I will see you all tomorrow. This is Paul Woodhead from World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Cheers, everybody.
Thanks.